Alright guys, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about this idea of militant fascism, which I know fascism is always militant, but specifically the move towards war, the point where it goes from being theoretical and focused inward and domestically to now, these powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan are going to start making war against their neighbors. And it's eventually all of this that will then eventually lead to the Second World War. I understand it's been brought to my attention that there is a problem with Lecture 2, the video, the audios unsynchronized. I will try to re-record that tomorrow, but if I can't, or in the interim, just do it as a podcast. I think I know what caused it, so I think it was pausing this, so we got water this time, so we should be good. I also think I'm over the cold, so hopefully the rest will be good. So we can really date when this is going to go on with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Because, remember, Mussolini cannot solve the various problems plaguing the Italian state. I mean, Italian fascism just simply doesn't work. Italy is just too poor. There's not enough, technological and economic innovation. And so Mussolini, remember his rhetoric had been, we need a new Roman Empire, Mare Nostrum. The Mediterranean becomes, quote unquote, our sea. So he decides to invade Ethiopia, and I should have, brought him out. But remember, Ethiopia is at the Horn of Africa. Okay, this is nowhere. It's a little near Italian Somaliland, which some, but not the main Italian colony of Libya. The idea had been realistically a quick foreign war to just get the people riled up, get them happy, divert problems from issues at home. So on October the 3rd, 1935, Italian troops crossed the border from Italian Somaliland. And the Ethiopian army, this is, these guys would have been militia or volunteers. They did have some rifles, they do have some light weapons, no tanks, no artillery, no aircraft. The Ethiopian army is pretty, inefficient. Many of the troops are, in fact, armed with spears. Now, the Italian army was also technologically backwards, though not to the same extent. Okay, the Italian soldier of 1935 was using the same artillery piece that his grandfather had used in 1915, was firing the same rifle his grandfather had used in 1915. His tank was quite literally called a tankette. The L333 and the L335 were small little 3-ton tankettes, and I should have put a picture. Hopefully I've got some when we get to the Spanish Civil War. If not, I'll find some later. But the tankette were small 2-man vehicles that what they did is they had the Contracarro version had the anti-tank version had a Solotorn 20mm anti-tank rifle. It's quite literally a oversized rifle with armor-piercing rounds designed to knock out light tanks. The Lancia Flamma had flamethrowers, but the majority, the base L333 tankette, simply had a twin machine gun armor, twin 8mm Modello 1935 machine guns. So what that means is the Italians technically have superiority in everything, but their stuff is inefficient and outdated. The Italian army had been designed to fight a war of defense. Pretty much expecting, a French attack or, either Austria or Germany through the Alps, stuff like that. Their army was largely defensive in nature. And so on the offense, it just simply did not perform well. It was not mechanized. It was, you have some trucks, but on the whole, it's not motorized. There's not nearly as many trucks to go around. There's not nearly enough mechanized stuff, which would be things like half-tracks or tanks. What tanks they have are really, 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 they're not good, but they also don't have that many of them. And in many cases, they're also using what would be known as the Fiat Model 1921, which is a product-improved Renault FT from World War I. The same stuff that, French and American troops were using in the Great War. So what we see is, the conflict theoretically should have been one-sided. More troops, more tanks, more planes, but the Italian stuff is so bad, okay, that it still takes about 6 months to conquer Ethiopia. And that's going to be a bit of foreshadowing because the Italian army is simply not good on the offense. It's not good when it has to attack. More than that, however, we see, here's the theme I want to, start beating in throughout, this part of the course, the failure of the League of Nations. Haile Selassie goes to the League of Nations. He explains what's going on. He says, look, Italy has invaded our country. Now is the time for you guys to do what you said. Pass sanctions. Now we need collective security. Do what you can to stop Mussolini's army. And the League does nothing. The League, more or less, says that Italy should be censured. They said what they're doing is wrong, but nothing bad actually comes from it. As such, okay, what we're learning is that the League of Nations is a colossal failure, and that's going to have massive repercussions. Before we get to that, I do want to mention OSU has a connection to Haile Selassie. In the 50s, I believe it was Henry Bellman, then president of OSU, took an active interest in rebuilding the country, rebuilding Haile Selassie's country. So if you're on the Stillwater campus, if you go over to the West Watkins Center, we have a number of artifacts from when then Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College was instrumental in rebuilding Ethiopia before Haile Selassie was ousted in a communist coup. And then, of course, being communist, well, if you've taken my Cold War class, or you want to take my Cold War class, as you'll learn, once you become communist, screw you guys, we don't care about you. But that's a topic for the 1960s. Back in the 1930s, with the failure of the League of Nations, it becomes blatantly apparent to anybody who has half a brain that you can invade your neighbor. Hell, you can invade somebody 1,000 miles away in this case, and the world will do nothing. The issue is we've still, people believe in the League of Nations. And there's also that theory I believe I mentioned, coined by historian A.J.P. Taylor, the idea of never again. That World War I was just so bad, so devastating, so bloody, and in the end so pointless that what could possibly be worth risking such actions ever again. And so it's in that light that the old Allied powers, who will finally, kick Italy from the Allied powers after this, do nothing. So the young chancellor from Nazi Germany, Herr Hitler, he looks at this and he says, aha, nothing happened to Italy, so nothing will happen to me. Now, the Treaty of Versailles had demilitarized the Rhineland. That's that area on the western frontier of Germany. And by treaty, no German soldier could enter the region. No German soldier could actually cross the border and, it's Germany, but German troops can't be there. But on March the 7th, 1936, the German army crosses the Rhine into the Rhineland. Now, understand a couple things from these photos. One, this is insanely popular. Okay, it's as much propaganda as everything. You see lots of people Heil Hitler, and you see they're marching with a band. But these troops had specific orders. If even one French soldier crossed the frontier, as by treaty they could, this is technically a casus belli. This is a case for war. The German army crossing into the Rhineland was ordered to just drop their equipment and run. Get the hell back across the Rhine. The French don't do it. The French say, again, it's not worth it. We don't want a war. There's nothing we can do. And so Hitler has learned he can get away with it. Hitler has broken the Versailles Treaty and can do whatever the hell he wants. And this will trigger massive German rearmament. Again, they say history is one damn thing after another. That's not really true. But, a couple of times where that kind of is, I think, is in the run-up to wars. Because just the hits keep on coming. It's like how 2016, is apparently directed by George R.R. Martin, the way people keep dropping like flies. The hits keep coming. Italy has invaded Ethiopia. The West does nothing. The Germans have remilitarized the Rhineland. The West does nothing. Now the Germans are going to rearm. You remember that bayonet I showed you? That German Carbiner 98 bayonet with the S-173G. Because the Germans didn't want to put who made it, because, for fear that, hey, we're breaking the treaty. 1935, we are not supposed to be making this. The Germans only did that for 2 years. By 1937, they're cranking these things out in the open because Hitler just doesn't give a crap. Because the West have made their intentions clear. They do not want to fight at all costs. And so it's out of this climate, the backdrop, we see the World Disarmament Conference, which will then spawn a naval conference we'll talk about in a second. Now, the World Disarmament Conference, various dates, 1932 to 1937, others 32 to 34. It just depends on how you want to date it, because it doesn't really work. What we're going to see is, the idea was, look, we need global disarmament. We got rid of a lot of battleships in 22. Let's get rid of some more. Let's cut down the size of armies. Let's do something to prevent a war. But Hitler pulls Germany out of it in 33. He then withdraws from the League of Nations, which, remember, early on they were banned from joining. Then belatedly in the late 20s they were allowed to join. Now in 33, Hitler pulls Germany out. So now what we see is France and Germany are each afraid of the other. So France doesn't really want to disarm because you have this resurgent Germany. Hitler, of course, doesn't want to disarm. And the whole point, if we can boil it down why we want a disarmament conference, it's predicated on the same issues as Versailles. We want German inferiority. If the Germans are kept with a small navy, a small army, no air force, no tanks, they cannot launch a war of aggression. Let them have what they need to sort of defend themselves, but do not give them what they need to, invade. So it doesn't work. Why? Because France isn't going to disarm at the same point that Hitler is rearming. And so the conference breaks down. And then the West, and I hope, I should have included, the Three Stooges triple face palm meme, because that's appropriate right now. If you don't think it's getting stupid now, just wait. This spawns the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. And what this means, what happens here, is Britain decides to go it alone with Germany. Britain decides maybe they can maybe they can get Hitler to do something. Now, here is the premise, okay? Whereas Versailles, whereas the World Disarmament Conference had wanted Germany to disarm and be inferior, okay? They know Germany is rearming. Hitler has all but said it. So with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, the idea is quite simple. Impose limits. We know that Hitler's going to build stuff. We know Hitler's rearming Germany. Maybe we can control how much he builds. Rather than, slapping him down and saying, no, you can't do this. Rather than saying, no, this is not something we're going to allow. Instead, it's like, oh God, I remember when I was a kid, when my cousin would get into a cookie jar, because, my grandparents actually still had those things, you get in trouble. Okay? It's like, no, you're gonna get a spanking. Me, I'm a fat kid, but I would rather not have a spanking than a cookie. That's my weight loss. If I got my butt beat for every time I ate food, I guarantee I'd be thin. So, that's what should have happened. Germany wants to rearm? Hell no. Here's the, British Navy off Wilhelmshaven, and here's a British expeditionary force in France. Give up your stuff. Instead, the British say, well, you stole the cookie. We know you're going to steal cookies, so because we don't want you to steal 5 cookies, we're going to give you 3. And we're going to hope that placates you. All of this tells Hitler he can get away with it. In the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, the Deutsche Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, it used to be, the High Seas Fleet, the Hochseeflotte. Now they're calling it, or then it used to be the Reichsmarine, the Emperor's Navy, the Emperor Navy. Now it's the Kriegsmarine, the War Navy. Okay? The German Navy is allowed to be 35% of the Royal Navy. Now, the British see this as, look, we have a 3-to-1 superiority. But remember, the German Navy had never been the size of the Royal Navy. Even in World War I, the German strategy had been what was called the Riskflotte, the Risk Fleet. The idea, let's have a fleet smaller, but enough that if Britain fights it, they will lose so much stuff it will threaten their naval superiority. Britain at the time had believed we have to have a bigger navy than the second and third navies combined. Any sizable fleet action ran the risk of diminishing that power. Now, they knew that Germany was renouncing the Versailles Treaty. They knew they were rearming. The thought was some regulation. But then they do something stupid. They say, yes, you can build modern battleships. Okay? Also, you can build U-boats. Not many, but you can build a few. So now even the Allies are throwing away the Versailles Treaty. This just opens the door. Hitler realizes he can do whatever the hell he wants, and the Allies are not going to stop him. And this is what I think leads straight to World War II. Because it's in this environment. We're going to get things like this, the Leichttraktor, the agricultural tractor, as they described it in the English presses. Now, I love teaching history. But if I can farm with a tractor with a 37mm gun on it, I quit this job. I'm going to be a farmer. Screw you, corn. I mean, about the only thing I can think anybody would need this is, I don't know, Fallout 4 to shoot bloat flies. But I mean, it's the thought. We know they're building this. We know this doesn't look like a frickin' John Deere. I mean, maybe they painted it green. I don't know. This doesn't look like a John Deere. We know it's a frickin' tank. But the Germans are saying, oh, no, it's a Leichttraktor. It's an agricultural tractor. Okay. Or things like, well, we don't want you building too many U-boats. Well, the Germans get U-boats quickly. Why? Because they've been building them for other people. Let's look at the Finnish Vesikko. Okay? This is a preserved Finnish submarine from World War II. It's exactly like the German Type 2C, which was produced, this was one of the earliest German U-boats, post-Anglo-German naval agreement. They're exactly the same, armed exactly the same way with similar specs. The Germans already had the blueprints. All they had to do was just say, okay, well, now we're going to, now that we can have them, now we can build them in German yards instead of French yards. Okay? German naval personnel are already serving overseas as advisors, getting experience. They already know what to do. Then we have to deal with the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. Well, can't have planes just yet, so let's have gliders. Let's train kids how to fly gliders. Let's do glider tactics, flying information tactics. Why? Because then you can give them powered aircraft, and these guys already know how to fly. It cuts the training in half. It's blatantly obvious what they're doing to anyone who would open their eyes. But the West has this idea, this mantra of never again. It's simply not worth it. We don't want a major war. So if we look, Germany, the glider corps had been existent since the 20s. The Leichttraktor also since the 20s. We see, 1935 Anglo-German agreement. You can now legally build U-boats. We start getting, the Panzerschiffe, the armored ships, what, the English press would call the pocket battleship. Okay? We start getting, German World War designs such as the Baden and Bayern class dreadnoughts. Upscaled, modernized, you already have the genesis for Bismarck and Tirpitz. Okay? And then by 1936, Germany just says, to hell with it. We are going to fully rearm. Suddenly, boom, you have new aircraft. Actual fighters, bombers, all this stuff. You have massive U-boat production. We start getting the Panzer I and the Panzer II. The Panzer I and II, all of this stuff. And the West does nothing. In fact, they not only let this happen, they encouraged it because they wouldn't stop Hitler. In history, we don't want to say that things are inevitable. Okay, we don't want to say that, well, this was inevitably going to happen. We also can't counterfactual hypothesis. Well, if they had intervened, World War II would be prevented. Can't do that. But it's blatantly obvious that, and Hitler will say, he does this because he knows he can get away with it. Because the League doesn't work. The Soviet Union, this whole time is saying, look, stop this guy. Do something. Don't let him have stuff. But Britain and France have this idea of never again. And so collective security, okay, which we, today we now know things like NATO, okay? If, the United States is attacked, Britain, France, all these NATO countries then will come in on our side, okay? Or collective security, the Entente and the Central Powers. But new stuff, the new idea just doesn't work. It all just falls apart. The League of Nations doesn't work. And why I have both sides switch is what we're going to see is the Soviets actively try to intervene. We're going to see that in the Spanish Civil War. But the Soviets can't go it alone. And eventually, by 1939, they say, you know what? To hell with it. We will appease Germany. So out of this, we're going to get the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact at the exact same time that the British and French finally realize, oh hell, we cannot placate Hitler. Hitler is an egotistical madman with a bad mustache who wants to rule the world. That comes later. That we'll talk about in our next lecture. For now, though, let's talk about the Spanish Civil War, which is going to go on between 1936 and 1939. And why this is so important is it's here that German rearmament, as well as fascism, are fully paraded on display, and the West doesn't really do anything. We're going to see that, in 1936, Spain's going to become a republic. They're going to oust the monarchy. And we're going to see that there's going to be a rebellion. The nationalists didn't really like the idea of a socialist-leaning republic. They liked the more nationalistic impulses of a monarchy. And, they're not quite fascist, but they have fascist leanings. And so Francisco Franco is their leader. They rebel. And this is a long and bloody civil war because it's not just simply the nationalist Spaniards and the Republican Spaniards fighting. We see that this is almost like a Cold War style proxy war. What we're going to see is, because, Francisco Franco has some fascist leanings, okay? The Germans and the Italians pour stuff in. They pour in troops. They pour in materiel. They pour in weapons. We're going to see the German Condor Legion, which are going to be actual regular German military troops coming in, ostensibly under the premise of volunteers, but they're actually ordered there. They're going to bring tanks. They're going to bring planes and modern artillery. We're going to see the Italian Corpo di Truppa Volontaria, the CTV, again, Italian, regular troops ordered there with tanks, planes, and all that. I mean, even Mussolini, I can't remember if it's his kid or his son-in-law, one of the two, will actually, be a pilot, and be shot down. And the Soviets are going to send actual volunteers. They're going to flood the country with weapons. And more than that, socialist or communist leading volunteers from all over the world are going to start sending actual legit volunteers. This, people start to see this as, look, this is the time to stop fascism. If you can give the fascist armies a bloody nose right here, it might avert a deadlier future. And so out of this, unfortunately, Spain just becomes this massive, destroyed battleground. We're going to see Spanish equipment, things like the T-26 light tank, or, the Maxim Model 1910 heavy machine gun. We're going to see things like, and apparently I didn't really include, I'm using my intercession notes to teach this, and I thought I had gone into more detail about the Spanish Civil War, but apparently not. So I apparently did not include. That's the one thing about World War II. There's just so much imagery and footage and stuff like that. There's so much more we could use, but unfortunately to keep it manageable, you just can't. But in the case of the Spanish Civil War, okay, here, the Soviets are going to flood all this up. And why this is important to American history, and I want to mention it, is let's talk about the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. These were a group of American volunteers who went to Spain to fight for the Republicans. And, some were communist. Most were not. Most just did not like the idea of fascism. But what we're going to see is these guys, they're going to be great fighters. They're going to do well. But they're going to be, well, to put it bluntly, they're going to be much maligned when they come home. Because the United States officially says you can't go do this, but they do it anyway. Then because a lot of these guys, the Republicans did have a lot of communists. They had, political commissars, not unlike the Soviet army. these guys were treated as subversives. So we're going to see in the Cold War, many are going to be blacklisted. We're going to see in World War II, these guys are obviously going to join up again, or want to, because that's why they go to Spain. And we're going to see that in many cases, they're not going to be allowed to fight because the army is, and the American military are terrified that they're going to spread communist propaganda. They're barred from entering. And then eventually during the Cold War, these guys will no longer be classed as subversives. The term to be used is premature anti-fascist. You did well. It's good that you fought fascism, but you fought it a little too early. You should have waited until it was our problem. You know, it's like the kid from oh god, if you remember, I want to say it's Robot Chicken. They did the little Hitler thing where the American kid is like, now it's my problem. That's what they're wanting. How dare you go and fight fascism early? Fight it when we tell you. But these guys were smart. They realized what was going on because, the fascists were, Germany and Italy specifically were building up their stuff. They're building up their militaries. They're testing, how stuff works. In Spain, they're rearming. And then out of the partnership of the Spanish Civil War, on October the 21st, 1936, we get the birth of the Axis powers. They sign a military alliance. And I believe it's Mussolini says that, because of this, the world will revolve around a Rome-Berlin axis. That's where the term comes from. They quite literally, if not were actually legit plotting world domination, were basically saying they were going to exert enough influence on world affairs that, this wasn't just going to be some random alliance. Adjust that a little bit. This wasn't going to be some random alliance, but rather this was going to be the start of reshaping world affairs. Now later, I believe 1940-41, Japan will eventually join them, and these are quote unquote the bad guys of World War II. Now, in addition, how we start seeing the cooperation between the various fascist elements is it was the Spanish Civil War. If we break it down ideologically, it's a conflict between fascism and communism. And understand, and we're going to see this when we talk about, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Fascism at its core hates communism. Okay, I'm shaking the table here, sorry. They absolutely hate communism. And so that's why they're going to put so much effort into this. By 1936, Japanese, events in Manchuria, remember the Mukden incident, as well as, advances in China, they're going to be forced out of the league. The Italians withdrew, the Germans have already withdrawn, and there's fear that because Japan is expanding in Manchuria, there's fear of war with the Soviet Union. In fact, they're going to be fighting border clashes from 1936 all the way to 1939, and then obviously it resumes on August 9th, 1945, the day of Nagasaki. The Soviets will cross the border into Manchuria. So what they do is Japan and Germany create a defensive alliance, the Anti-Comintern Pact. Remember how I had mentioned how the Soviets create early on the Comintern, the International Communists, that everybody has to be a communist nation for it to work. November 25, 36. What they say is if the Soviets were to attack Japan, Germany would declare war on the Soviet Union. We start to see an intricate alliance system. 1937, Italy joins the pact, which is hilarious because the last time I checked, Italy does not share a border with the Soviet Union. Admittedly, geography is not my strong suit, but there you go. But what we see is even before the Axis powers become all three, by 1937, all three have, a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. And that's really key when you remember that while Hitler was imprisoned in Landsberg prison back in 1924, he had written Mein Kampf, where he talked about the idea of Lebensraum, laid out his plan for conquest, and that was in the East. Okay? We can see already by 1936, people are looking towards the Soviet Union. That is, the East. That is where the war is going to go. Hitler does not want a war with Britain and France. His hope is use the Spanish Civil War as something like a testing ground. Okay, here are my other pictures. use it as a testing ground, and then, march eastward. And we're going to see that in the 1930s, he's going to pick off a lot of these territories as he, in this march to getting ready to be able to go into Poland to then go into the Soviet Union. So I'd already talked about stuff like this, volunteers, the Republicans, the German Condor Legion, the Corpo di Truppa Volontarie, and everybody sends planes, tanks, rifles, machine guns, anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails, anything you can think of. And it's here we test modern weaponry, and we test all of this rearmament stuff. So things like the Heinkel HE-111, 1937, that thing that 2 years before was not supposed to exist. Now the Germans have a fairly decent twin-engine bomber. That, in the Spanish Civil War, they're going to be able to refine their bomber tactics, refine their planes, and it's the HE-111. I mean, this is going to be the mainstay of when the Germans bomb Britain in the Battle of Britain. It's not the HE-111E, but they can get that experience to manufacture stuff. And instead of that, also understand, this creates some, bad lessons for the German Wehrmacht, the German war machine. It teaches them that war should be quick and slow, okay? It teaches them that their stuff that they have works and works well. So understand, if you have this image of the Germans, Iron Sky, the Nazis on the moon, or the Verfundingswaffe, the wonder weapons, okay? In reality, okay, up until about 1940-41, the Germans are mainly using 1930s tech. The HE-111, okay, front line bomber 1940, it's doing stuff in 37, okay? When the Germans go into France, the Panzer II, the Panzer I, 1930s tech, okay? The Bf-109, the most produced fighter aircraft in history, 1930s tech. And what that means is the Germans do not have the industrial base to constantly innovate, not yet. Okay, when they build something, they build it to last, and they get the most use out of it. But by the time, by mid-war, okay, 1943, the United States fully involved, their stuff is decidedly obsolete. They cannot innovate the same way we can. And while we're going to get some fantastic German weaponry, okay, I'm thinking, the Sturmgewehr 44, the Focke-Wulf 190, the Tiger, the Panther tank. They can never make enough of them because their industrial capacity just isn't there. For the Italians, here we go. At the Battle of Guadalajara, these are L-335s. We see in the background a couple of normal ones with, again, the twin machine guns. And the one here in the foreground that's a little bit blurry is a Lancia Flamma. That's a flamethrower projector. And somehow two guys are going to fit in that. And to give you a sense of how small, if I were standing up, okay, if I were standing up, the roof of the tank would come right about here on me. Okay, that is how small and cramped these things are. Fat guys not allowed, apparently. Their armor was only sufficient to stop rifle bullets. So while it works, the Soviets send along anti-tank rifles, and kathum, that's it. You can put these things out of action. The Germans learn the lesson and innovate. They don't have a great industrial capacity, but their stuff is calling for a war in 1946. They have time to innovate. And yes, by this time, Hitler wants a war, and Hitler is planning mid to late 40s to do it. But the Italian industry can't innovate. Okay, if we look, okay, here we've got the L-335s. It will take them until 1939 to get a medium tank, which is only 11 tons. It weighs the same as everybody else's light tank, and it has a crappy gun. Then it takes them until 1940 to get a couple of new tanks, and they're always going to lag behind. The Italians cannot innovate and produce in quantity. The Germans can innovate. They have time to produce in quantity, but come wartime are not going to be able to do it. And so what we get out of the Spanish Civil War is that it's a vastly new kind of warfare. People had learned from World War I. Okay, we're getting the theories for the Germans of Heinz Guderian, who, will write, Achtung Panzer. And what he will do is he will write the tactics for armored warfare that will be the genesis of blitzkrieg tactics. The Germans never call it blitzkrieg, okay? That's an American term by an American reporter with the invasion of Poland that stuck for the Western powers. The Germans never called it that. But the essence is mechanized warfare. Don't rely on the infantry. You need highly mobilized, you need motorized infantry, mechanized infantry, so motorized being truck-borne, mechanized being half-track that can go anywhere, mechanized forces, so tanks, and, above all, don't get bogged down in linear trench warfare. The war must be highly mobile. The Germans predicated everything on quick, sharp wars. So we're going to see, things like the Soviet T-26, arguably the best tank of the era with a 45mm gun. We're going to see the Germans are going to field Panzer Is with twin machine guns, which with armor-piercing rounds could knock out T-26s, but not really. And the Italian L-333 and 35, which again, the twin machine guns, the Flamme, whatever. The issue we're having is the Germans, the majority of the Panzerwaffe, their tank arm, were well into 1940, largely Panzer Is and Panzer IIs. The Panzer I had twin 7.92 MG34s. The Panzer II had a 20mm autocannon with a coaxial MG34. But these were training tanks. They were not designed for combat. Understand, Hitler is going to become so convinced he can get away with everything that his war, which his generals and admirals told him can't begin before 1946, breaks out in 1939, and the Germans are not ready. The Panzer I is going to suffer horrendously, okay, in the Spanish Civil War, 37 to 39, and it's still going to rack up losses before it is finally retired in 1941. It sees its last actions in the deserts of North Africa and the frozen wastes of Russia. It takes them that long to get rid of it. We're going to see, total war. Okay, the idea that total war typically has two aspects. One, that we're going to mobilize a civilian populace, but also that a civilian populace, because it can be mobilized, is now a legitimate target for destruction. We're going to see the bombing of Guernica. And this will spawn a Picasso painting. I should have put it in here. I thought it was, but I guess I didn't. The bombing of Guernica by those Heinkel 111s. And what we're going to see is now we have the ability to completely destroy cities and towns. And now it becomes acceptable to do so. And why that's important is this is a foretaste of what is coming in World War II. The bombing of towns here, Guernica is seen as an isolated incident. The world is shocked. But in World War II, let's look at the Battle of Britain or the bombing of Germany or the bombing of Japan. This becomes commonplace. So what we see, it's modern weapons, it's new doctrines, new tactics, new technology. World War I is clearly the influence, not because we're doing things the same way, but because we are so desperate to avoid a stalemate. And I say we, I should say the Germans, even the Soviets, everybody. Now, while that's going on, okay, again, the hits keep on coming. The Japanese, for the same reasons, remember, they have now been militarized because, to deal with their economic problems, want to broaden their, spheres of influence. And so, they've had a long history with China, and unfortunately, it's not a very good history. And, they've fought several wars, but in modern memory, 1894, okay, the first Sino-Japanese War. And it was a clear Japanese victory. Then, you've got expansions in the region, since the Russo-Japanese, 1904, 1905, stuff like this. And so, there'd been some actions. 1932, they're going to bomb Shanghai. 1936, there's going to be some border incidents. And then in 1937, they just invade. And this war will last 1937 to 1945. Now, what's interesting is part of why they do this is because, remember, China had been in the throes of civil war. You've got nationalist forces fighting the communists, okay? And what will happen in this, the Japanese see that as the perfect time to strike. You're going to see sort of truces in the sense the communists and nationalists will sometimes put aside their differences, but quite literally it could be a case of a nationalist army would fight the Japanese one day and then go fight the communists the next. And as a result, they can't, the Chinese can't win a clear victory. But China is huge. The Japanese army is going to get bogged down. Now, China's going to get military assistance from the United States. We're going to back the nationalists. The Soviets, obviously the communists. But what's interesting, as of 1936, the Germans have a defensive alliance with Japan. But Germany needs money, so they're selling military weapons. Panzer Is, Panzer IIs, I believe. Model 1935 Stahlheims, Carabiner 98 rifles, equipment. All of this are selling it to the Chinese. They're quite literally supporting the enemy of their ally. It's really, 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 really confusing. Now, understand, this war, the Second Sino-Japanese War, is incredibly bloody. It's absolutely horrible. It's savage. A couple of images are probably going to, distress you, but understand, more Chinese will die at the hands of the Japanese than Jews at the hands of the Germans. That's just how bad it is. Because for the Japanese, remember, there's a racist component. You would think, being an Asian nation, they would seek solidarity. I mean, after all, they're calling it, the East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But in reality, the Japanese were incredibly xenophobic and hated anyone that was not Japanese. So out of that, we're going to get things such as the Nanking Massacre, where civilians are often brutally attacked and murdered. Many are going to be raped. Heads are going to be cut off by samurai swords. Whole blocks of cities are going to be destroyed. And the Nanking Massacre itself, something approaching 250,000 Chinese civilians in Nanking, many of whom are women and children, are going to be beaten, raped, tortured, and then murdered. There are any number of images of women being beheaded or Chinese civilians being shot at and then buried in mass graves. This is absolutely horrible. And the world does nothing. Now, this war, if we speak in a larger sense, will eventually stalemate. And when it does, because again, the Japanese, industry is finite. And I say that, they have amazing industry. Okay, remember, they've been open to the West since 1863. Sorry, I had something on my finger. Open to the West since 1863. The British had majorly helped them industrialize. They had done really well for themselves. But there's the issue of raw materials. Specifically, Japan as an island nation is deficient in almost everything you need for modern war. Iron, tin, rubber, manganese, zinc, copper, all this stuff. They're deficient in it. They've got to get it from elsewhere. And what happens is they import in all of this stuff. That's great until world opinion decides they don't like what you're doing. And what we're going to see is this will directly lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Because in 1941, the United States will embargo oil. And we more or less say, if you pull out of China, we'll give you what you need. But we are not going to fund your war effort. That forces Japan to obtain new raw materials. They decide to do so in the Dutch East Indies. And to do that, they then have to go through the Philippines. Oops. Now, the one kind of happy thing we can talk about with, the Second Sino-Japanese War beginning is as the Nanking Massacre is going on, 1937, an American gunboat on the Yangtze River, remember, this is still the era of the China Marines, stuff like that, comes under attack by Japanese dive bombers. This is the Panay incident. And they're beaten, the gunboat is eventually sunk. A number of Americans will be killed. And this almost triggers, an international incident and war. It doesn't, but this is enough to start swaying American public opinion away from the Japanese. Now, the one humorous thing I can talk about is in just one of those quirks of history. There was a news crew on the Panay at the time, and so they filmed almost the entire battle. And as they do, as the ship sounds battle stations, people go to the battle stations. One guy who was so, I guess distressed at this, ran to his battle station, began manning the anti-aircraft machine guns, shooting at Japanese planes, and the whole time forgot his pants. And then, of course, nobody knows his name, but if you Google pantsless gunner, there you go, preserved for all of history. So if there's one thing you take from this course, other than don't invade Poland, the other thing is always go to bed with your pants on, because you never know when you're going to end up on the nightly news. All right, I know, bad joke, but for those of you that have had me before, I love to tell jokes. World War II is kind of tough. There's some things I can do to tell jokes. There's some things I can do to lighten the mood. But it's a very serious topic. And it's really hard to go from Nanking Massacre, innocent women being beheaded, to making a joke. So I'll try to sneak in jokes when I can. What I might have to do for the humor, this is what I do when I teach this in class, I'll destroy your childhood with Disney World War II cartoons, because there are a ton of them, and they're on YouTube, so we can have some fun with that. So while this is going on, okay, so now you've got Germany rearming, you have the Spanish Civil War going on, you have the Second Sino-Japanese War. It's quite obvious the world is blowing itself to hell. Hitler wants more. He is rearmed. He's gone into the Rhineland. He's gotten every concession he wants. So now he wants more territorial expansion. And he sees Austria, his southern neighbor, as being ripe for the taking. Austria had been isolated. Remember, it had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But as of Versailles, the whole thing was broken up. And Austria itself was fairly weak. And so Hitler came up with the plan to and this is how he sold it, both this and later for Czechoslovakia, to unify all German-speaking populations into a single country. The epitome of the idea of Großdeutschland, way back in the 1840s and 50s, when they were talking about German unification, the idea was Kleindeutschland or Großdeutschland. Do we unify everybody or all the smaller states around either Austria or Prussia? And what had happened was Kleindeutschland. All the small states unify around Prussia to create Germany. But now Germany decides it wants everybody. Austria had also seen a civil war in 1934. And so what we're going to see is, although Austrian leaders want independence, obviously they want their own country, Hitler presses for control. He threatens war. He threatens all these economic sanctions, blockades. We're just going to stop trading with your country. We'll let you go into bankruptcy. Not to mention, people in Austria wanted, many people actually wanted, the Anschluss, unification. Because they see it as a case of, look, Hitler is transforming Germany. Germany has gone from being bankrupt to, we've made Germany great again. We have autobahns. We have a rebuilt military. We're now able to dictate terms to the world. We're fighting in Spain. We can do all this stuff. And so many, many, many people actually opted for this. So even though, The Sound of Music, we're getting this singing and dancing away from Nazis, in reality, many people quite enjoyed the Anschluss. There were obviously those that didn't, but many did, in fact, hope to do so. And if we look at, the Anschluss ballot, do you want Adolf Hitler? A big thing, yeah, and then a kind of tiny thing that says 9. And, again, I don't know what the secret ballot laws were, but considering the Nazis were already using assassinations, the Nazis were already beating people up in Austria, much as they had in Germany, I can't imagine many people willingly being, I can't imagine many people openly proclaiming 9 on their ballot. They're given a choice, and then the Nazis cross the border in March 1936. And so if we look, now we're setting up the pattern. Okay, here's Germany as it was post Versailles 1919. Now the Rhineland has been remilitarized. Now they've taken Austria. Now Germany sets its sights on the Sudetenland. There's a heavy German-speaking population there. Not to mention, okay, if Hitler wants to take over Czechoslovakia, okay, the Sudetenland is where he's got to go through, and the Sudetenland is the most defensible part of the country. Now, why would he want Czechoslovakia? That's the question. Well, one, again, the idea of Lebensraum, you're going to expand to the east, as well as the Czechs had what was called the Skoda Works. And at the Skoda Works, this was one of the best military plants in the world. They made some of the best anti-tank guns. They made some of the best tanks. The LTVZ-38. They made decent planes. And Germany needed new industry if it was going to expand for war. So the Czechs, however, whereas the Austrians, many had actually wanted to be, wanted the Anschluss, while there were troublemakers in Czechoslovakia, the majority wanted independence. They had just gained independence from Austria-Hungary back in 1919. They wanted to hold on to it. Everyone's afraid of war. Even, Italy had kind of flirted with military action against Hitler over Austria. But now it's the fact of the Soviets are scared of war, the British are scared of war, the French are scared of war, and they're all like, look, what's Czechoslovakia? If you've ever seen, and it's obviously a hardcore conservative comedy movie, An American Carol. It's I forget who all's in it, but I know Leslie Nielsen has a bit part in it. Oh God, I forgot his name. Frasier. The guy who plays Frasier in the series Frasier. Kelsey Grammer. There we go. He plays the ghost of General Patton. I know. Just bear with me. But there's a scene where they reenact Munich. And you see the guy doing Neville Chamberlain, and he's like, and we'll throw in Czechoslovakia. I can't spell it. We'll just make it Poland. Can't spell Czechoslovakia, so who gives a crap? It sucks, but it's kind of the mantra. What is Czechoslovakia compared to however many British lives or however many French lives? That is the mindset. And Hitler starts bolstering, threatening war, and he even says, by October the 1st, 1938, we will go to war against Czechoslovakia. Because Hitler's mindset is the West, the Allied powers will do nothing. Britain and France will not do a single thing. That he can get away with this. That is the thought. But they convene a conference at Munich in Germany where the representatives, some from the United States, some from Britain, some from France, some from Italy, and some from Germany, all meet to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia. Who is not there? If you said the Czechs, then you would be correct. The Czechs are not really consulted. Now, this is done in 1938. And the Czechs are like, look, if we lose the Sudetenland, what are we going to have? What are we going to be able to do? How do we defend our country? But Britain and France, who are fine with signing it away to prevent the war, said, look, if you don't do this, we will not back your country in the event of war. And so, if Germany goes to war with you, you guys are on your own. The Czechs were fine with it, but then, just had to relent. The Czechs were not ready for war. So what we're going to see is if we look at Czechoslovakia, okay, they lose the Sudetenland. That becomes German. Parts of, the Slovakia area get taken over by Poland and Hungary as part of this. The Czechs are left defenseless. This is absolutely abhorrent. Nobody has even bothered to ask the Czechs what they wanted. And then you get Neville Chamberlain, the biggest idiot in the history of idiots, who flies back to London. He's got this, and he says, I have in my hand a signed piece of paper from Herr Hitler that states he wants no more territory in Europe. This is peace in our time. And people just broke out in spontaneous applause. But every time he says that, I imagine the Charlie Brown episode where he's going to go kick the football. And it's like, it's a signed document. It's a signed document. And then Lucy says, funny thing about signed documents, It wasn't notarized. That's basically what it is. Everyone thought that this piece of paper would be enough, but it's not. March the 14th, 1939, Slovakia secedes illegally, declares independence. Then German troops invade and cross the border. Czechoslovakia falls almost overnight. Now that they have the Skoda works, they can build things like the Panzerkampfwagen 38T. This is the LTVZ 38 now taken into German service. They've taken over all those AT guns, those planes, things like the LTVZ 35, a horrible light tank, but a tank all the same. I've not really used the form of appeasement yet, but that's what this is, this philosophy of never again. The idea of appeasement being that if we appease Hitler, if we give Hitler that little bit of what he wants, he'll back the hell off and not want more. But what actually happens, what appeasement does, is it makes Hitler think, I can get away with it. That I can do, I can rearm. Nothing happens. So I'll invade the Rhineland. Well, nothing happens. So I'll take over Austria. Well, nothing happens. Well, I'll take over the Sudetenland. Well, nothing happens. The West realizes appeasement was bankrupt. There's all sorts of war scares. Hitler goes in and takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, or I guess at this point, just the Czech Republic. They do nothing. So Hitler sees even as they're, all of this stuff, all of this bluster, for lack of a better term. Still, nothing happens. And so Hitler realizes, wait a minute. If they did all this, they didn't do anything. What can I get away with next? He's always looking for the next thing. If he can gobble all this up without war, so much the better for him. At this same time, Italy decides it wants to get involved. So Mussolini had always thought he was the main guy. After all, he had been the original fascist back in 1922. He, first guy. So he's like, well, wait a minute. Germany is getting all this stuff. So for about 5 days, in April 7, they invade Ethiopia. Now, they do this for naval strategic regions so they can control the Aegean, as well as he wants a staging area with which to later invade Greece. Now, why I mention this is, again, there's still no League of Nations reaction. There's still no major condemnation. Britain and France are just sitting around with their head in the sand, not doing anything, and the Germans are quite literally getting away with everything. And now Italy is getting away. Not to mention, Japan is currently fighting in, China, and nobody is doing anything. So against all of this, what I want to do is we'll pick up with the desire for Gdansk, Danzig, and Falk-Gleiwitz next time. But I want to talk just a little bit about why this war is going to be different. By April, everything is ready for the start of the Second World War. The borders are finalized. Poland is the next target. The Germans have various tank types by now. They've got the Panzer I, the Panzer II, some Panzer IIIs armed with low-velocity 37mm guns, the Panzer IV with a low-velocity 75mm howitzer. They have the Panzer now 35 taken over from the Czechs with a 37mm gun, and a Panzer 38 with a 47mm gun. They have now perfected, in the Spanish Civil War, the combined arms doctrine of artillery, infantry, mechanized troops, read tanks, and aircraft. They've used things such as the Junkers, Ju-87 Stuka, the dive bomber as a sort of flying artillery. They've trained, they're veterans, they know what they're doing. They now have excellent armored doctrines done, and again, if there's going to be a war, Germany has not mobilized its industry. Because the thing is, it's control. If you have to mobilize your industry, you're in a war, you can't necessarily always believe you're winning. But if you can rake in all of these victories and never have to be, you yourself never actually impacted, you start to think you're doing really, really, really well. So what we see is the Germans need a quick war. And so every victory they've gained with that war has helped them. And so they think that they can bluff their way into getting Danzig, then they think they can bluff their way into getting all of Poland. The German army, the Wehrmacht, is large, it's well trained, it's well equipped. All this cooperation, the stage is set, and the West has gambled away all of their time. But if the army is excellent, there are two major shortcomings in the German system these are going to spell doom for Germany. One, it's their air force. I talked about how it's great with air-land cooperation, but it's a tactical air force. They're used to supporting blitzkrieg. They're not capable of sustained aerial bombardment. That's why they're going to fail in the Battle of Britain. Whereas the United States, we have the ability to bomb almost every German city at the same time we're bombing the majority of the Japanese cities. And, our big bombers, the B-17, the B-24, can carry this huge bomb load. Those German Heinkel 111s can't. They can't do it day after day after day. The other thing is the German Kriegsmarine is not ready. It's just not prepared. Their building construction program, Plan Z, is not set to even begin to enter service until 1946. They have great U-boats, the Coastal Type 2, the Type 7 Medium, the Type 9 Ocean going. But they have a grand total of about 30 of them, the majority being Type 2 coastal training boats. Germany has new surface raiders, things like commerce raiding ships, stuff like the old World War I Q ships. They have Panzerschiffe, but they're battleships. Most of them haven't entered service. All they have in that category are Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, each with 9 11-inch guns. They're fast. They're modern. But in terms of broadside, the Queen Elizabeth and Royal Sovereign class dreadnoughts that Britain has retained since the First World War, although much slower, throw a heavier broadside. Each has 8 15-inch guns versus 9 11-inch guns. The Royal Navy, it's older. It's scattered across the globe. The Kriegsmarine, yeah, it's small and modern, but the two cannot effectively challenge each other. And so what this means is, although there's going to be some, fun battles, there's going to be all sorts of stuff like that, the superiority is still on the side of the Royal Navy because they have more stuff when they can concentrate it. They have better training, and, a modern ship might be good, but, let's flash forward to 1941, Battle of the Denmark Straits, the hunt for the Bismarck. The Germans send out a lone battleship, the Bismarck, and a heavy cruiser, the Prince Eugen, to go do commerce raiding. Now, commerce raiding, that alone is not bad. But the British can mobilize a dozen cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 2 battle cruisers, and I believe 3 or 4 battleships. It's just, granted, Bismarck doesn't have to fight all that at once, but it's just simple. Weight of numbers is in the British field. The Germans are not ready for the Second World War when it begins, and so that is going to prove disastrous. All right, on that happy note, we'll call it good for today. I will see if I can re-record Lecture 2. Otherwise, if I can't, just use it as a podcast. Otherwise, take it easy. If you've got any questions, let me know, and we'll pick up with the invasion of Poland next time. All right, have a good one, guys. Bye-bye.